Vamos cubanos, se debe de...
Somos escudo y bandera,
somos
comité de defensa. Cuba en revolución sederista siempre alerta.
Vamos a cantar. Somos la gente del barrio, un juego de dominó. Somos tradición, esencia, somos mucho más que dos.
Somos quien tiende la mano, el vecino más cercano, los comités de defensa, orgullosamente cubanos.
Comité de defensa,
Arriba
Cuba
cubanos.
en revolución sederista siempre alerta. Somos escudo y bandera, comité de defensa. Cuba en revolución sederista siempre alerta.
Sentimos orgullo inmenso al defender lo logrado, al desfilar con amor cada 1 de mayo.
Donaciones de sangre, listos a tu llamado, pues somos de Patria o Muerte, los LR, mi hermano.
Comité de defensa, Cuba en revolución sederista siempre alerta. Somos escudo y bandera, comité de defensa. Cuba en revolución sederista siempre alerta.
Dilo, dilo.
¿Viste lo que te dije?
El abrazo del abuelo, un beso tierno de abuela.
Cuba en revolución sederista siempre alerta.
Cuba no vale pa'lante, que esto no hay quien lo pare, no.
Cuba en revolución sederista siempre alerta.
Sentimos orgullo inmenso de defender lo que somos.
Cuba en revolución sederista siempre
Ay,
alerta.
apúrate vecino que esta fiesta va a empezar, tenemos que celebrar.
Cuba en revolución sederista siempre
Y
alerta.
cogemos.
Compórtese.
Cuba en revolución sederista siempre alerta.
Allá.
Cuba en revolución sederista siempre alerta.
En el Congreso seguimos sonando.
Sonando está la
Sabemos lo que queremos, por eso estamos luchando.
estamos de fiesta.
Oye, mira la caldosa, que bien quedó. Pero sonando está la orquesta.
Estamos de fiesta.
Vamos cubanos a mover el cuerpo aquí.
Sonando está la orquesta.
Arriba que empezó la fiesta.
Los sederistas estamos de fiesta. Sonando está la orquesta. Los sederistas estamos de fiesta. Sonando está la orquesta. Los sederistas estamos de fiesta.
Guajiro.
Sonando está la orquesta.
Dale que te cogió la bananera.
Los
Vamos.
sederistas estamos de fiesta.
Suénalo, muchachos.
Sonando está la orquesta. Los sederistas estamos de fiesta.
Y es que estamos en Congreso, no te quedes al lado. Súmate.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to tonight's webinar. That was a beautiful song to start us off, celebrating Cuba's committees in defense of the revolution. Today is the 63rd anniversary of the CDRs and an important day in Cuba. They are marking the 10th Congress of the CDRs. So we thought we would share that to begin our webinar here today. I really want to welcome folks to this webinar, hopefully good conversation and discussion at a critical time for Cuba when we are seeing more and more every day the necessity and urgency to redouble our efforts to lift the blockade on Cuba and remove Cuba from the list of state sponsors of terrorism. So this webinar tonight, The Cuban Economy Under Siege, Why President Biden Must Remove Cuba from the so-called state sponsors of terrorism list, is timely and important, and we're really grateful for your presence. My name is Allison Bodine. I am with Friends of Cuba Against the US Blockade Vancouver, and also on the editorial board of the Fire This Time newspaper here in Vancouver, Canada. And I'm an organizer with the US-Cuba Normalization Conference Committee, which is the organizer of tonight's webinar and represents an cross-border organization of activists in solidarity with Cuba from both the United States and Canada. Before I go further, I want to acknowledge that this event tonight is being broadcast from the unceded, stolen, and traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And as we defend Cuba's right to self-determination, we also stand with Indigenous nations and defend their right to self-determination. I ask people to reflect on what that may mean for you and your activism, and to post in the chat where you are joining us from here tonight. I'm excited to have a co-MC, co-moderator tonight. The co-MC is Taris Iriarte, who is an organizer with the New York, New Jersey Cuba Sea Coalition. She's an independent curator and arts activist from Brooklyn, New York, with Afro-Caribbean roots in Cuba and Puerto Rico. She is simply known as T in her beloved communities and for the rest of tonight. And T is what happens when a human loves art, the earth, and justice. She's a proud Afro-Puerto Rican working diligently on the global liberation of her people across the diaspora through socially engaged art. T curates exhibits that contextualize the intersections of diasporan artists across the socio-political landscape. And T believes in the power of collectivity by responsibly fostering critical art practice within a local and global context. So not only a co-moderator, but bringing a lot to the table too for tonight's webinar. There is interpretation tonight for the webinar. So if you haven't discovered that yet, to listen in English, I'm of course speaking in English right now, but you can press the globe icon on your screen. Might also be under the 3 dots if you're participating through a phone or a tablet, and choose under interpretation English if you want to listen to English. We also recommend the mute original audio function if that's better for you. Thank you to Julieta and Celeste for your support and assistance with simultaneous translation tonight. Hay interpretación. Si está escuchando este webinar en inglés y quiere participar en español, en castellano, hay interpretación para la acción anoche, en el webinar. Para escuchar en español, presione el icono de globo que está en su pantalla y elija español. Gracias a Julieta y Celeste por su apoyo anoche. Now I will pass the mic over to T. Welcome.
Hi, good evening, everyone. We have 3 excellent speakers present with us tonight, followed by some important special announcements and a chance for questions at the end. So I'm excited to do that with you all. Also, the fall is going to be a busy time for the Cuban Solidarity Organization and solidarity organizers in the US and internationally. And we hope that the webinar will inspire you to get more involved. And due to the time difference today, our next speaker may have to leave a bit early, but feel free to post questions in the chat in the Zoom box. And we are live streaming on Facebook as well. If you would like to share a video with our Cuban friends, and you probably know that part of the criminal US blockade on Cuba is blocking the Zoom. And of course, sometimes our special guests are able to find work around the blockade to join us. So here we share our webinars on Facebook, and Cubans are in solidarity movement in the US, Canada, Quebec, and internationally. So I am going to introduce our first speaker for the evening. Her name is Dr. Helen Yaffe. Dr. Helen Yaffe is a senior lecturer of economic and social history at the University of Glasgow, Scotland. Her teaching focuses on Latin American and Cuban development since 1995. She has spent time living and researching in Cuba. Helen Yaffe is an author of Che Guevara, The Economics of Revolution, and We Are Cuba, How a Revolutionary People Have Survived in a Post-Soviet World.
Thank you.
Welcome,
thank you,
Dr.
Thank you, T,
Yaffe.
for the introduction. Thank you, Alison, for holding up my book. Thank you to the organisers for organising this really important event. I'm going to put my stopwatch on because I've actually written quite a lot of material about the US blockade, and it's very hard to synthesize in 10 minutes. And a lot of you participating in this webinar will know a lot about the blockade. So we are here, of course, to really pinpoint the impact that it has on Cuba, but also to demand that Cuba is removed from the state sponsors of terrorism list, which has a direct impact in terms of how stringent sanctions are imposed. And Isaac SANEY is going to talk more about that, I believe, so I won't speak too much about it. I'm going to try and just sum this up in 5 points. The first is we need to be clear what the intention of the United States blockade is, and that was, as many of you will know, encapsulated in a memorandum that was written by Lester Mallory, someone who was advising the government on how to respond to this new revolution in 1960 on the 6th of April, recognizing the popularity of the new revolutionary government, how difficult it would be to remove that government. The proposal was to use economic warfare against Cuba. And I'm citing directly, the purpose was to create hunger, desperation, and overthrow of government. So, you know, a lot of you have recently been to Cuba, and what you can see is there is scarcity, quite severe scarcity. There is growing frustration. And this is clearly just an extension of this suggestion to use economic pressure to try to create social pressure, which is what they've been doing for over 6 decades. So let's not forget that. That's another key point to make about the United States blockade of Cuba. It is the longest and most extensive blockade in modern history. I think you have to go back to 1640 to find anything equivalent. It also affects every sector in Cuba. I mean, I research on different sectors of development in Cuba, and it's impossible to research on an area. And Cuba has some extraordinary developments, and many of them have been under the radar. So I've been, trying to research into these, but it's impossible to do that without coming up directly against the impact of the US blockade. So whether this is in Cuba's extraordinary state plan to confront climate change, which really does demonstrate how governments should be responding to this existential threat. Cuba is, of course, a small island developing nation on the front line of climate change, and they can't get early warning detectors for meteorological incidents because they come from the United States. So whatever it is, biotechnology, a lot of you will be well aware that Cuba was the only country in Latin America and the Caribbean to have the medical science capacity for its biotech sector to develop a vaccine for COVID-19. And yet they were held up in their mass vaccination campaign because they couldn't get syringes. You know that in summer 2021, they had a peak, their first surge with COVID-19 cases. Fatalities went up, contagion went up, still well below the figures that we saw in the United States, in my country, in the UK. But, at that time, their medical oxygen plant was basically exhausted by the pressure, and they couldn't get spare parts. We know that the same is true of the electricity system. I believe that there is a recurrence of blackouts at the moment, and all of this is linked to the US blockade. It affects every sector. Now, I just want to say something about Cuban medical internationalism, and in case any of you think I'm in the wrong webinar, I will explain the reason. I mean, Cuba has an extraordinary record of sending medical professionals and other development aid workers around the world. So statistics vary, but you can comfortably say that by 2018, 400,000 medical professionals had worked in 164 countries, saving and improving lives. Now, what has this got to do with the blockade? Well, there is a Guatemalan researcher called Henry Morales who has assessed Cuban medical internationalism from the perspective of overseas development assistance, and made a compared it to the way that ODA is assessed globally and the OECD countries, given all of that medical assistance a monetary value in order to make a comparison. And the results are quite astonishing. So he concludes that between 1999 and 2010, Cuba's overseas development assistance was $71.5 billion, which works out at $4.87 billion every year in that period. That represents 6.6% of Cuba's GDP. At the same time, the contribution from the United States was 0.17%, and the contribution from the European Union was slightly over. But the point is that if we recognize that this costs Cuba $4.8 billion every year, and then we also look at the cost of the United States blockade, which again is estimated between 4 and 5 billion US dollars every year. And then we start to think, this is economic damages to Cuba, given the country's track record of generosity in assisting those who most need it, in the poorest people in the poorest countries in the world. Cuba potentially could double its overseas development assistance if it wasn't being impacted to this extent. So really what I'm trying to say is the blockade isn't just about the impact on the Cuban people. Given their modus operandi, given their internationalism, the US blockade is also killing people overseas indirectly by affecting Cuba's capacity to continue and expand its overseas development aid, which, by the way, has incorporated, it's been claimed to have saved the lives of 6 million people just in that short time frame, and certainly improved the lives of many, many more. So I really wanted to make that point. I also want to make another point, which is really important. The United States blockade is not a bilateral issue. This is not about preventing trade only between the United States and Cuba. This is one of the strongest myths that is generated from Cuba's opponents in the United States, whether they're Cuban Americans or politicians or whatever. There is also a lot of myths about exemptions that, Cuba, what's the problem? Cuba can buy medicine and food and so on, but actually the way that is formulated is so complicated and so conditioned that effectively it's extraordinarily difficult. And I hope Bob Schwartz will talk about how hard that has been and the important contribution that they have made to be able to assist Cuba in that way. But the other point is that we call it extraterritorial because the blockade is not just an issue that affects US territory or Cuba, it is affects the whole world. And the extraterritorial character of the US blockade was actually built into legislation as early as 1962, when legislation said that any country that assists Cuba or any other communist country would face its US foreign aid being withdrawn. So it was already more or less since the inception making this an issue that it could use to force other countries to participate, to be complicit in the attempt to isolate Cuba. Another thing, I'm almost running out of time. I want to say that in response to the extremely extraterritorial character of the US blockade, which has been increased since 2009 because of Cuba and because of the Trump measures, which has specifically targeted the international financial system, because of the decision by Trump to put Cuba back on the state sponsors of terrorism list, the blockade is suffocating Cuba and is something that affects all of us in any country. And I could give many examples, but even as an academic, my university is completely reluctant to allow me to do projects with Cubans. I mean, personally, I have tried to send money for humanitarian donations to Cuba after the hurricane, after the fire, and my bank is blocking those. And they absolutely recognize that they are violating UK law. And likewise, banks in Europe are violating European law, which make it illegal to apply US sanctions, which is, only should operate in their jurisdiction against people outside those countries. So there is a new campaign. Well, it's not so new now. It was set up last year called the 1 Cent for Cuba campaign. And it is precisely to expose and challenge the complicity of UK and European banks with the US blockade of Cuba, and to do that at low cost to participants. So this will probably not apply to anyone here in the US who has a US bank account, but we have the participation of activists in Canada, in Vancouver, in this campaign. So those of you who are from Canada should be participating in the campaign. It's very, very easy URL. Perhaps someone can pop it in the chat. It's 1C4, the number, Cuba.eu. The other thing is, I don't know if anyone else is planning to flag this up, but there will be an international tribunal against the US blockade taking place in the European Parliament 16th and 17th of November. And that's also another way that we can mobilize to really expose the US blockade for what it is. It's a violation of human rights, it's a violation of national sovereignty, and it's a violation of international law. I'll stop there, and I will stay with the webinar for as long as I can, but as T said, it's very late here, it's now 1:20. So thank you very much for inviting me to speak.
Thank you, Dr. Helen Yaffe, for spending time with us in your early morning. We really appreciate your insight and, of course, your continued study, not only about the economy in Cuba, but Helen also has been working with others on helping popularize Cuba's work against climate change, which I think is really important at this moment also, and Cuba's leading role in that. So I'll hold up the book again for everyone to see. The latest book by Helen Yaffe, We Are Cuba, highly recommended. Helen might have some tips for us, but generally just find it on your online booksellers, I think is the best idea. So encourage you to get a copy. I want to introduce our next speaker, who is, as T mentioned, overcoming challenges of the blockade, but been able to join us on Zoom tonight, which we are really grateful for. And that is Dr. SILVIA ODRIOZOLA GUITART, who we're really honored to have as Dean, I'll say that again, as Dean of the Faculty of Economy at the University of Havana, Cuba. So really an important voice in this webinar, and we're just so excited to hear from you. Dr. SILVIA ODRIOZOLA, welcome. The floor is yours.
Bueno, yo voy a hablar en español, como ya había anunciado. Quiero también agradecer a los organizadores por la invitación.
For their invitation, but most especially for these kinds of initiatives that are added to the different initiatives we are seeing in Cuba and around Cuba, abroad. Those friends of Cuba who insist and don't lose their hopes that one day they will see the end of the blockade. And of course, the exit of Cuba from the list of countries that sponsor terrorism. And I wanted to explore an idea Helen mentioned. I don't wish to repeat what she said. I know that I need to be short and sweet, but the blockade is part of a war. It isn't just part of an economic confrontation. It's part of something that affects every aspect of our lives in Cuba. And any of these aspects has an impact on the economy, which is what I will be discussing today, because this confrontation, this war, goes beyond the economy. But I will focus on the economy, but at the same time, all of these aspects that are not economic also have an impact on the economy. And the other element she mentioned, and that I wanted to point out, is that indeed that there's an extraterritorial feature here. We can set some examples because it doesn't just affect the normality of the relations between both countries, it also affects third countries. So, for example, with regards to this, there are some numbers that are quite evident. After the announcement of the beginning of the normalization in the relations between Cuba and the US, backed by Mr. Castro and Obama, the number of potential investors who approached Cuba grew exponentially. The amount of visitors from abroad, in particular from the US and other countries, and other people who lived in the US, grew exponentially in the past few years. So tourism has never grown as much. And as we know, tourism is one of the main development factors in our country. And that was affected just by the announcement of the normalization of the relations. Just by that announcement in 2015, 2016, the amount of investors who came to our country to establish trade relations with Cuba just by seeing the normalization scenario. Unfortunately, with the government of Donald Trump, there was a backslide and the situation even became worse because we were saying that the blockade has a history as long as the Cuban Revolution, but in the past few years, there has been a worsening of these blockade measures that have also moved to the business aspect and the financial aspect, which has been one of the main factors for the blockade. When Dr. Helen was talking about professional services, in particular in health, the anti-Cuban campaign that was held against Cuban doctors, because back then it was one of the main sources of income in the country, and of course in a context of the arrival to the government of non-progressive leaders who cut their relations with Cuba, that also affected our economy. So we were affected by that anti-Cuba campaign in terms of health and doctors. Now, the impact of the blockade on the Cuban economy can also be seen in how difficult it is to find spare parts, resources, the fact that Cuba cannot do direct business with the US, which would be one of its most natural business partners, just because they are closer geographically. So that makes it so much more expensive to do business in Cuba. And that affects the resources or whatever we need to import. So we need to find things in more distant places, which of course makes everything more expensive. More recently, for example, there was an impact on fuel. The fact that ships cannot come to the Cuban harbors. That, of course, has a strong impact on the energy supply or in the import of food, which is necessary because of the limitations in our production. And that, of course, affects our access to fertilizers, for example. Connectivity is also a factor. This was mentioned during the introduction. It's very difficult for us to access certain platforms. And of course, this affects the academic sector because of how many possibilities we see now in virtuality, because now these events are possible, and that makes it so much cheaper for us to meet. And that's a legacy of COVID. We can access also journals, scientific journals, but also that could give us access to the best technologies to improve production methods in our country. And as Helen was saying, the myths, right? The myths built around the blockade just to justify it. And I would like to focus, the last thing I will say, I promise, I would like to focus on the myth about how the blockade is against the government and not the people, and not the private sector in Cuba, which, as we know, in the most recent transformations, the private sector has played a bigger role in terms of development. And that's a myth. It's a myth that the blockade doesn't affect the people or the private sector. In spite of the recent attempts to promote so as to try to, because they have tried to make the private sector go against the people. But of course, the drop now in the amount of tourists from the US has affected the private sector. And of course, that affects businesses, hotels, cultural services. That has an impact on the banking sector because it is impossible to use banks, not just American banks, but also foreign banks that are prosecuted and fined by if they use money from our country. That has implications. And of course, that makes transaction costs much higher, especially because Cuba is still unable to have transactions in US dollars. Cuba is unable to access sources of international financing like the World Bank. And of course, that has an impact as well in the search of alternate financing sources or the money that is sent by our family members who live abroad. And that, of course, affects investment and used to allow us to expand our private sector. Now there are limitations on imports for the private sector and for exports as well. And of course, the law that does not discriminate who is the owner that benefits from the land. So it's part of the myth, right? Because the blockade affects the people, it affects the economy and the citizens. It affects all countries that, regardless of their political systems or regimes or whatever ideology they follow, even for or against the Cuban politics, that affects their development as well, because they are unable to work with Cuba, to have trade with Cuba, to invest in Cuba. A couple of months ago, there was an announcement of several measures with regards to some sort of flexibilization in the blockade policies, in maybe trying to have easier visas or allowing family members to send funds from abroad. But the biggest issues of the blockade remain there. Cuba continues to be in the list of countries that sponsor terrorism, and those actions have an impact on Cuba's access to goods and services that it could export and import from the rest of the world. and in particular in the search of funds, of financing, so that we can develop our country. Because that's what the people of Cuba want. We want a more inclusive society that's better for everyone. So I wanted to thank you all, and thank you so much for having me at this webinar, but also I would like to thank you on behalf of the Cuban academic sector and the Cuban economists. We know the efforts you make so that we can remain together in our fight against the blockade. Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Dr. ODRIOZOLA.
Mike VERA from the Inlandboatmen's Union of the Pacific Southern California Region Marine Division, ILWU, who recently traveled to Cuba. This video is approximately 10 minutes long, and so I would love to have our cue up the video.
Good afternoon, brothers and sisters, comrades and fighters for the Cuban people. My name is Michael VERA, and I'm a 25-year member of the Inlandboatmen's Union of the Pacific Southern California region. The Inlandboatmen's Union is the Marine Division of the International Longshore and Warehouse Union, the ILWU. We represent inshore mariners up and down the West Coast, having regions in Alaska, Puget Sound, Columbia River, San Francisco Bay, Southern California, and Hawaii. We fight for tug and barge crews involved in ship assist work and transportation of energy and goods. We represent ferry boat workers and sailors in the marine construction industry. I am currently serving my fourth three-year term as a patrolman business agent and have worn many hats in my years in the IBU. I am also a delegate on the ILWU Southern California District Council, which is the union's political action committee. In addition to working as an officer of the union, I am also a rank and file worker who's employed as a boat captain with one of our companies. As with most union advocates, I spend a fair portion of my time informing myself and fighting for social justice near and far, and I've been involved in the fight against U.S. policy on Cuba for a few years. Recently, in late April of this year, I had the privilege to travel to Cuba and see firsthand their reality and the devastating impact U.S. policy has had on Cuban society. Upon arriving in Cuba, I was able to immediately witness a country in struggle. There were long lines queued up at the gas stations, and many people were walking because of the reduction of public transportation due to fuel shortages. We were met by a gentleman named Miguel Angel, who was the International Public Relations Director of the CTC, the Cuban Trade Federation, which organizes 90% of the workforce in Cuba. He had arranged transportation for us by bus to the Hotel Puesta del Sol, which was not a tourist hotel, but was owned and operated by the CTC in the outskirts of Havana. Conditions at this hotel were surprising to myself, as I've not been to Cuba before. It was apparent that maintenance on the building and the plumbing system were in disrepair, and necessities such as cleaning supplies, toiletries, and paper goods were in short supply. The hotel staff were very gracious hosts and made do with their situation. It was here that I was able to attend a week-long internship organized by the CTC with 101 attendees from various trade unions from 11 Latin American, Central American, and Caribbean countries. This was the first time that the United States had a delegation that was able to attend. The U.S. delegation, which was organized by Mark Friedman and the LA U.S. Hands Off Cuba Committee, included 37 unionists and working class activists. Among the participants were Chris Smalls of the Amazon Labor Union from Staten Island, Amazon warehouse workers from Raleigh, North Carolina, and from ONT 8 Amazon Center in the Inland Empire here in California. There was also unionists from the United Steel Workers of America, Local 675, and members of the International Bakery, Confectionery, and Tobacco Workers Union. This internship gave participants a chance to discuss the state of the labor movement in the Americas and the historic importance of defending Cuba from Washington's hostility. International solidarity was a central theme, and at the conclusion of the internship, a resolution was approved calling for the international protests when the annual vote demanding an end to the U.S. embargo against Cuba takes place this fall at the United Nations. There was much to absorb, with a curriculum focused on the understanding of how trade unions work within a socialist structure. I learned that much of the issues regarding labor law was simplified in Cuba by including as much as possible into the National Labor Code. Unlike the United States, the CTC and labor in general has a seat at the table with higher government representation. In addition to the curriculum being taught at the Lazaro Peña Convention Center, our delegation was able to visit various sites and enjoy some important exchanges. We were able to visit the CTC headquarters for a question and answer with union leadership, and we visited the University of Havana, met with approximately 75 students and professors, which was hosted by the Federation of Union Students, the FEC, and the unions that represent the university workers. The meeting discussed world politics, the state of the U.S. labor movement, and campaigns for material aid for Cuba organized across the United States. The education system in Cuba is phenomenal, but the one thing that became apparent to me was that there was a shortage of material supplies and equipment for much of the laboratory studies. It was quite a treat to tour this beautiful and historic university. We also were able to visit the Calixto Garcia Trauma Center in Havana, and with the help of groups, global health partners, and not just tourists, the LA-US Hands Off Cuba Committee was able to deliver more than $40,000 worth of much needed medical aid and supplies, which we traveled with in additional suitcases. This group also donated about $5,000 worth of tech equipment to the CTC, as well as art supplies and scientific instruments to the Cuba National Aquarium. Another member of our delegation, who was a member of the United Steel Workers, was able to visit a sheet metal manufacturing plant and reported that production was at a virtual standstill because of the inability to source a part for one of their sheet metal bending machines. A trip that I very much look forward to was a visitation of the shipping port of Mariel, which is located west of Havana. This trip was canceled because of the transportation that was not available due to the gasoline shortage. These were all very insightful exchanges in which our delegation was able to further understand the challenges faced by this country. This year, due to severe fuel shortages caused by the blockade and damage to the Matanzas oil depot, the usually massive May Day celebration in Havana was organized on a smaller regional basis. The largest rally in Havana was planned for the Malecon, the avenue that spans the city's waterfront, in front of the building that houses the U.S. Embassy. But heavy rain and winds the night before disabled and damaged much of the sound systems and the temporary structures set up at the rally sites, causing a postponement of the May Day celebration until May 5th. This trip concluded the day after, on May 2nd, at a conference at the Palacio de Convenciones, where over 1,300 delegations from 58 countries representing 271 organizations congregated to celebrate the International Meeting of Solidarity with Cuban and anti-imperialism 200 years after the Monroe Doctrine. At the opening of this meeting, Cuban President Miguel Diaz-Canel spoke of the broad context of Cuba's current situation. The pandemic had paralyzed the country for 2 years. He had talked about 3 disasters in succession: the explosion of a gas line that demolished the Saratoga Hotel in Havana, the lightning strike that destroyed part of the country's largest supertanker port, and lastly, Hurricane Ian, which did vast damage to the island and to the prime tobacco growing regions, which devastated one of Cuba's major agricultural exports. He spoke of intensified economic, financial, and commercial obstacles due to the blockade, but he also spoke of the resiliency of the Cuban people and their ability to grow in solidarity and unity. His main ask of those attending is to redouble the demands to condemn the blockade and denounce the inclusion of Cuba on the U.S. list of state sponsors of terrorism. This was a very moving conference in which to this day I'm very proud to have been part of. Since returning from Cuba, I was able to work with the Inlandboatmen's Union national leadership to pass a resolution on state sponsors of terrorism, in addition to the 2 resolutions that the Southern California region passed in October of 2022, which is to lift the embargo and SSOT. I also co-authored a resolution on SSOT passed by the ILWU Southern California District Council with the help of my colleague Floyd Bryan, who is also a member of the Building Relations with Cuban Labor Committee headed by Mr. Bill Camp. Involvement in various actions continue. Most recently, the LA US Hands Off Cuba Committee was able to host a fundraising concert in which $2,500 was raised for Global Health Partners. I continue to look forward to informing myself and participating in any capacity in the fight for the Cuban people, their right to self-determination, and their right to security and prosperity. Thank you.
Deep gratitude to Mr. Mike VERA for that video, an insightful video.
Yeah, really excellent to hear about his experiences in Cuba. Yeah, for sure. So I think T, we're gonna actually, read the next part about donations and a reminder for questions in the Q&A.
Yes. I just want to put a reminder out to everyone to donate if you are able to contribute to the honorariums for our awesome translators. Any amount is much appreciated. You can send a transfer to Allison Colette at gmail.com via Zelle or Cash App, $ Allison Bodine, or e-transfer if you're for Canada, Allison Colette at gmail.com. Also, if you do have questions in terms of for our panelists, please put your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll be getting around to those as we conclude the webinar.
Yeah, looks like we've already got some good ones coming in. So thank you everybody for doing that. So next we have Dr. Isaac SANEY joining us. Dr. Isaac SANEY is a Cuba and Black Studies specialist at Dalhousie University here in Canada. He is associate professor and coordinator of Dalhousie's Black and African Diaspora Studies program. And the first and to date, this program is the first and to date the only of its kind in Canada. He is author of Cuba, A Revolution in Motion, and Cuba, Africa, and Apartheid's End, Africa's Children Return, which is the new book that came out in 2023. We're going to post a link to an article later, but Isaac, the floor is yours. Welcome. You are on mute.
Yep, it's not a so first, I'd like to thank everyone for having organized this webinar and for the wonderful talks that preceded this. I won't take too much time because I think a lot of ground has already been covered. We know, for example, that the placing of Cuba on the state sponsors of terrorism list is obviously, a duplicitous, egregious, and extremely aggressive move that was taken under Trump and has been continued under Biden, right? This is an arbitrary list that is only about expanding and entrenching the US imperialism's hold on Latin America and on the world. We all know a new multipolar world is probably in the making. We see all sorts of tectonic geopolitical shifts unfolding. But against Cuba, we have witnessed for over 60 years an economic war aimed at asphyxiating the people of Cuba. Placing Cuba on this list, as has already been pointed out, places extra pressure on Cuba's access to banks, financial institutions, investments, and is also an attack on Cuba's tourism sector. Those people who didn't need visas to come into the United States could get the ETSA. If they've been to Cuba, they must now apply for a visa to come into the United States. And quite often, this is obviously an attempt to say to people that if you visit Cuba, we will close off the United States to you. I think all of this, more or less, I don't need to go into much greater detail. We all understand the extent of the US economic war against Cuba, to asphyxiate the economy, but to destroy Cuba as an example of independence, and also to destroy the possibility in the eyes of people that another world is possible. We can imagine a world that is not only anti-capitalist and socialist. This war has been waging for over 60 years. But within the context of this, Cuba has been a paragon, an incredible exemplar of international solidarity, not only in its aid to Latin America, to Africa and other countries in terms of medical brigades, but as an example of independence and an example that it's possible to build a country of social justice. Particularly in the Caribbean, which is often forgotten about. We have seen the nations of the Caribbean, small countries, often dismissed as places where people go for sunshine, to party, listen to calypso and reggae, and drink coconut water. We have seen the Caribbean, which has a long history of resistance to the transatlantic slave system. Before that, even indigenous resistance. We have seen the Caribbean, which has produced the Grenadian Revolution, but before that, obviously, the Haitian Revolution, the first independent Black Republic in the Americas and the first successful slavery revolution in history. And of course, Cuba has seen itself as a historical partner, as historically tied to the Haitian Revolution, seeing the crucifixion that Haiti faced in the face of its successful revolution by various imperial powers, reflected in the attempt of imperialism to destroy it in the 1960s. And of course, Cuba itself is part of the Caribbean. Yes, we think of it as part of Latin America, but Cuba is part of the Caribbean. And Cuba has assisted the Caribbean in so many of its development projects. And it was the CARICOM nations, the 15 nations of the Caribbean community, former English-speaking colonies, that have taken the most profound stand. In 1972, as nations became independent, these countries established relations with Cuba. And there was a historic meeting that took place in December of 2022 to commemorate the 50 years of relations between Cuba and the CARICOM nations. And at that meeting, it was decided to declare October 6th as the CARICOM Cuba Day Against International Terrorism. And in fact, that day itself not only deals with the fact that the Cubana 455 airliner was destroyed, killing all 73 people aboard, but the fact that it intersected not only with Barbados, where the explosion took place off its coast, but with Trinidad and Tobago, where the bombs were placed. Also, in terms of Guyanese who were traveling on that plane that were killed, and as well as the license of the Cubana pilot washing up in St. Lucia. So CARICOM has declared October 6th as the CARICOM Cuba Day Against International Terrorism, but they also encourage other countries to take up that day, not only to point out that Cuba has been the victim of terrorism. Over 3,000 people have died as a direct result of that. There have been over 680 documented terrorist attacks against Cuba. So to place Cuba on that list is not only duplicitous and hypocritical, it is an attempt to rewrite history and to turn history on its head, where the victims become the victimizers, right? And where those who rain terror on people are seen as peacemakers. We have a recent example of that in the Canadian Parliament, where a Nazi war criminal was applauded by all members of the of not only the government sitting MPs, but also of the opposition. A war criminal elevated to the position of being a freedom fighter until the people who knew the easily found historical record were able to expose this. We are exposing that Cuba is a victim of terrorism, and CARICOM hopes to transform October 6th, not just into the Cuba CARICOM Day Against International Terrorism, but into the International Day Against Terrorism. And there are plans to actually bring that forward to the United Nations as a resolution to have that designated as the United Nations International Day Against Terrorism. The Cubana airliner that was destroyed on October 6, 1976, in which all 73 people were killed, many of them young people, was the first example of terror against an airliner until September 11th, right? The first example of that, the most important example of that, right? And so Cuba has been a victim of terrorism. We are going to set, in a sense, the historical record correctly, and in terms of pointing out that it is Cuba that has been a victim and is not a sponsor of terror. In fact, Cuba has been a bulwark and a force against terrorism in itself, particularly state terrorism. So we call on all the persons involved in this call, and there's an international call across the world that on October 6th, when CARICOM will be marking this day with a number of activities across the island, but particularly against the monument that sits in Payne Bay in Barbados, a beautiful monument to the victims, a beautiful monument to the victims, but it's also an incredibly harrowing and deeply moving monument to the victims of terrorist attack, that we will also engage across the world in our own solidarity activities with Cuba, marking this day as the International Day Against Terrorism, and also using this as a means by which to call for the removal of Cuba from this odious list of state sponsors of terrorism. Viva la Revolución Cubana, la lucha continua, la victoria es cierta. Thank you.
Thank you, Isaac. We appreciate your insight always. And next, I'm going to introduce our dear comrade, Mr. Bob Schwartz. Bob is going to share some information with us this evening. And Bob Schwartz is the Vice President of Global Health Partners. He has more than 35 years of experience building support for Central American economic and social development programs, primarily in the area of public health. He's on the advisory board, member of the ACERE, Alliance for Cuba, Engagement and Respect. He is going to be speaking with us more about the Global Health Partners, the Cuba. Welcome, Bob.
Thanks, T. And before I start, I'll keep my remarks very short tonight. I want to thank Mike VERA and the Los Angeles Committee, the Hands Off Cuba Committee. They did an incredible job in raising funds for Global Health Partners. And I'm not sure if Mike is with us live tonight, but I think he'll be happy to know that some of those funds have already gone to purchase anesthesia machines. And we have 2 containers already staged, ready to ship to Cuba, which will go to the Calixto Garcia Hospital that he mentioned, as well as hospitals all across the island. So the nice thing about speaking after Helen and following her is that all of the key points have already been made. So I'm not going to go over a lot of statistics and a lot of detailed information about the Cuban healthcare system and the impact that the embargo has had on public health in Cuba. But instead, I'd like to use this little time to give some insight into the conversations that took place last week here in New York with the Cuban delegation that came to the UN. And we were fortunate enough to meet both with the Cuban president and the Minister of Health, and had a very frank exchange about the crisis in the public health system and the problems that we're confronting as Global Health Partners. And to be very honest, this is the most difficult time that Global Health Partners has ever had working with Cuba. I started with Cuba during the special period in the 90s, so I've been there Next year will mark 30 years. And I can't remember a more difficult time and a more challenging environment to be sending humanitarian donations and working with Cuba. And a lot of that has to do with, as Helen mentioned, as Dr. SILVIA mentioned, as Isaac mentioned, Cuba's designation as on the SSOT list. By way of background, Global Health Partners has shipped more than $250 million worth of medicines and medical supplies to Cuba, to the Ministry of Health. Let me just tackle really quickly on the donations front. The designation, the SSOT designation, has made it extremely difficult to purchase. I'm not talking about donations, I'm talking about purchase material for Cuba. Many of you will remember the syringe campaign that we undertook 2 years ago to enable Cuba to execute their COVID vaccination program. We had to go through vendor after vendor after vendor in order to finally purchase the 6 million syringes that we shipped to Cuba. The reality is that people look at the SSOT designation and they don't want to sell if they know we're shipping or exporting to Cuba. And the same is true on the donation side, that companies are reluctant to donate to Cuba when they can give to any other country. In many cases, that the perception is it's a safer place to work with. And having tackled both of those issues, we now have transportation problems. And I gave President Diaz-Canel a very good example of some of the challenges that we confront. We ship a lot of cold chain medication, that is medication that is transported under very tight temperature conditions. So we can't simply put it on a ship and send it down to Cuba. We need commercial carriers to take it that are licensed to handle cold chain shipments. Pre-pandemic, we were able to ship New York, Toronto, Havana. We were able to ship New York, Bogota, Havana. We were able to ship New York, London, Havana. All of those routes are now closed. And a lot of it has to do with SSOT, the fact that there's not a lot of tourists going to Cuba, and it's not commercially viable for the airlines to transport any longer. So our most recent shipment, we're talking about roughly $1.5 million worth of medicine. The reality is, if the Cubans don't get that medicine, people die. And I'm not saying that as an exaggeration, people die in Cuba. So our last routing was New York, Brussels, Madrid, Havana. And I can't tell you how surprised the Cuban delegation was to learn that. I was going to tackle the impact that SSOT has on commercial relationships. Helen mentioned a little bit about that. The reality is companies in the United States don't want to tackle anything commercially with the biotech sector because of the lack of clarity as to whether or not you're going to get a license eventually to sell it. And the last point is the collaborations. You know, we've done over the years more than 36 surgical delegations to Cuba, where doctors were able to work for a week with their Cuban counterparts and train doctors in advanced surgical techniques. The Cubans have the surgeons. They're dying for these type of collaborations. I think there are two big collaborations with the United States right now. There's one with Roswell Park on cancer. They have a license. And there's a new one with the National Cancer Institute in Cuba and the University of Virginia. But the reality is, because of the SSOT designation, universities and nonprofits liability insurance doesn't cover travel to Cuba. That's an important point. You know, there's a handful of universities that are willing to travel and to take the risks, but the reality is that most universities that are looking for relationships with the island can't do it because of liability insurance. I think I'll stop on those points because I just want to very quickly mention what Mike Vera talked about and what many of you have helped, and that is the funding for more humanitarian donations to both the Calixto Garcia Hospital and hospitals across the island. We're raising funds again. Global Health Partners has a great track record. We're looking to send more anesthesia machines, more suture, and more surgical equipment. I've never seen the lack of essential meds, of medical equipment, of, you know, when I talk about people dying, if you need an operation and you don't have suture, the surgeons can't perform the surgery. So the reality is surgeries are being pushed back, elective surgeries are not being done, all but the most essential surgeries are now being done. So we're looking to, you know, put Band-Aids on a problem that is not going to go away until the SSOT designation is lifted, and hopefully we can start the normalization process again. So I know I've run over my time here, T. I think I'll stop there, and if there's questions later on, I can go on for the next hour. So let me stop there, and we'll go to the next speaker. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Bob. Yeah, there was a fair number of questions in the chat around this. Can you compare today to the special period? So we're hoping for some reflection on that. If you have further ideas, but also from Dr. SILVIA ODRIOZOLA, who I'll ask in a minute to address that question as well, because I'm sure there's important comparisons and differences that are good for us to understand. You also focused on the state sponsors of terrorism list, and it's really helpful to concretely understand how that impacts the blockade, why it's a part of the blockade, and why our efforts are well spent focused on getting Cuba removed from this list. And for me, of course, we haven't recognized it yet in this webinar, but I do want to recognize the disgusting irony of Cuba being on that list, including in the light of the recent terrorist attack on the Cuban embassy in Washington, D.C. On September 24th, terrorist attack occurred as reported by MINREX when an individual threw 2 Molotov cocktails from the sidewalk of the perimeter fence surrounding the embassy, and it hit the front wall of the diplomatic mission. There were no injuries to the personnel who were present at the headquarters, but this is a serious attack coming after a very successful initial visit of Miguel Diaz-Canel to New York City, to the UN General Assembly, and really, I think, an example of the terrorism that Cuba has faced at the hands of the United States. So I know that many people are here with organizations that have written statements condemning this terrorist attack, have described the ways that Cuba has been impacted and made calls for further organizing and calls for justice when it comes to this terrorist attack. And I encourage people to please post in the chat the statements that you've written. We can share those around, reshare them online, make sure that the US knows that the world is watching and that we are taking this very seriously as solidarity activists, and that we see this as a call for, to continue our work to really get Cuba off of this terrorist list. So thank you, everyone. And really extra big thank you to all of the speakers tonight so far. We do have one specific video we're going to share before we go into some announcements and then some question and answer. The video is coming to us from the National Network on Cuba, and it is a special announcement regarding the conference of the National Network on Cuba taking place in Boston. So I'm going to go ahead and share this now.
National Network on Cuba thanks the organizers of today's webinar for the opportunity to announce our 2023 annual meeting. We invite you to join us October 13th, 14th, and 15th in conjunction with the UMass Boston Africana Studies Department's Pan-African Forum and our local member organizations. The NNOC is an umbrella of 57 member organizations working to end the blockade of Cuba, recognize the independence, sovereignty, and self-determination right of our island neighbor, and calling for the return of the land occupied by the notorious U.S. Guantanamo Naval Base. At our 2022 annual meeting, the NNOC initiated an off-the-list campaign that took the demand to the White House on June 25th. And through our resolutions task force, organized the adoption of more than 30 off-the-list resolutions this year alone, most among central labor bodies. The now more than 100 resolutions show that US residents are locking arms with the world to demand that the illegal war, US war against Cuba, end. The NNOC is responsible for organizing US participation in the International May Day Brigade annually. It's sponsored by ECAP and the CTC. But our 2023 meeting will focus forward. You can find out more and register at nnOC.org. That's nnOC.org. In addition to the NNOC business meeting, the weekend will include much more, including Cuban voices. But the heart of our NNOC meeting is going to be the breakout groups to develop concrete strategies to move forward in the new year. Rejuvenating the movement, solidarity success, building Cuba solidarity in the labor movement, breaking bias, media mastery for Friends of Cuba. Saturday evening in Noche Cubana features Belly of the Beast award-winning journalist Liz Oliva Fernandez and the documentary being unveiled as her national tour begins. Johanna Tablata will address us on Sunday. We look forward to continuing the momentum when the annual vote takes place in November, and then closing out the new year, organizing new generations to know Cuba firsthand in an upcoming youth friendshipment meeting. So join us on October 13th, 14th, and 15th at the University of Massachusetts in Boston, and in the fight to get Cuba off the list and end the illegal war of starvation against the Cuban people and the government that represents them. Victory in unity.
All right, so thank you to Cheryl Labash from the National Network on Cuba for preparing that video invitation. There will be links in the chat about registering for the National Network on Cuba conference. I know and believe, I'll double check and we'll put it again, that Bob had announced regarding the Global Health Partners campaign. I just want to put that link again in the chat. We're just going to spend this time doing some announcements as people get their questions ready and our speakers get ready to answer them. So go ahead, T. Next announcements is yours.
Okay, so thank you. I just want to extend again a thank you to our wonderful panelists for informing us and leading us and guiding us in their work and in Cuba, and just continuing to push for our people in Cuba and just sharing their insight tonight. So thank you very much to every single panelist tonight. The first announcement again is going back to signing up and registering for the October 13th NNOC meeting in Boston. Again, I'm just going to share the link that is nnOC.org. That is where you can register to participate October 13th through the 15th at University of Massachusetts. Additionally, Sunday, October 1st, 2023 at 12 p.m. Pacific time and 3 p.m. Eastern time, we have another webinar, Positive Legal Changes as Cuba Leads the World in LGBTQI+ rights, celebrating Cuba's first anniversary of their Families Code and documentary film showing of butterflies on the scaffold, featuring film director Margaret Gilpin. You can register for the next webinar on October 1st via the link. We will add that into the chat as well.
Tonight's webinar was organized by US-Cuba Normalization Conference Committee. We meet twice a month, and I want to encourage people to join in those meetings and help plan for future events and build this united campaign against the criminal blockade on Cuba. You can also go to the website. There's local contact info for different organizations, resources, the resolutions passed, and a toolkit, as well as travel action, as well as information about street actions and the Puentes de Amor car caravan campaign. So check out the website for more information.
It did. I thought she was in it. How come Mike didn't tell them? Okay.
And then we've got the Let Cuba Live, make October 6th an International Day Against Terrorism webinar on October 6th, commemorating the terrorist attack on Flight 455 and the 73 people who lost their lives. Of course, a bombing of an Air Cubana flight by anti-Cuba terrorists. This is one of many events happening, and this is one organized by the Canadian Network on Cuba on Friday, October 6th, 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern. The registration link is in the chat.
Wonderful. And again, these links will be available for you to register for the various events. Also, you can sign up for our email announcements list via the different websites. Plans for October 6 actions in solidarity with CARICOM. That would be the Cubana 455 film also, which Aaron actually shared the flyer post in the chat earlier, but we will reshare. And then protests in the fall around the UN vote on the blockade, which is very important. That will also be available for you to see on our website, and then come to the US-Cuba normalization meeting again. We just want to reiterate that. Thank you, Allison, for sharing that information as well. Yeah.
Sounds good. And that brings us to some of what we heard about earlier. There are speaking events with Cuban journalist Liz Oliva Fernandez from Belly of the Beast. These are going to be happening across the US. Really encourage people to find that information. They're going to start very soon, including the NNOC conference, as we heard, and go coast to coast. So we'll post the tour information in the chat and a link for how to get more information. Here, I'll just say, Norma and others, yes, the settings for webinar are not, it's not possible for us to make it possible for you to copy the chat right now. It will not happen. So we're going to put everything into a Google Doc that you will be able to download. All the links will be there and you'll be able to download it. So just watch out for that in the chat. If that isn't working for you, you can click the links directly now. It'll open a window in your browser. Just go back to it later and we'll try and fix that for next time. So thank you so much. I wanted to say the next announcement, which is November 1st and 2nd, which is the UN vote we heard about. This year, for the 31st consecutive time, the world will once again condemn the US blockade on Cuba with an overwhelming majority at the United Nations. And the US-Cuba Normalization Conference Committee is organizing a 24-hour picket action online to commemorate this. There will be live reports from the United Nations, greetings from around the world, and videos maybe of all of you. So there'll be information going in the chat. The 24-hour global online picket will start Wednesday, November 1st at 8 p.m. Eastern time and go until a special closing event, which will begin at 7 p.m. the next day on November 2nd. The information in the chat for how you can send us a video or get involved in organizing the action will be there. You can contact the WhatsApp and the email there.
Thank you, Allison. And then also join the Biden Cuba is not a state sponsor of terrorism postcard campaign. This campaign, which began as a collaboration of the Friends of Cuba against the US blockade, Vancouver and New York, New Jersey, Cuba C Coalition, is now also endorsed by IFCO, Pastors for Peace, Vancouver communities, in solidarity with Cuba, Seattle and Cuba Friendship, the committee and the European campaign Unblock Cuba. Thousands of postcards have been shipped to friends of Cuba across the United States and Canada and have been sent to the White House. We will be glad to mail you any amount of postcards you wish to join the campaign and help you distribute them in your area. Email us at nobloqueo Vancouver@gmail.com to get involved. And the fundraising campaign, Jardín de Luz, special aid to the Special School for Children with Disabilities, the Canadian Network on Cuba, and the Association de Cubanos Juan Gilberto Gomez Jardín de Luz announced a joint fundraising campaign. So Jardín de Luz, special aid to Special School for the Children with Disabilities. The funds raised go toward supplies for schools in Bayamo Grama for children ages 5 to 11 years old who have disabilities. The area was very hard hit by the flooding, and there's a dire need right now for the region in general. So I hope that you will consider donating and supporting this, the postcard campaign. There are 2 payment methods available to make a donation through e-transfer to associationjgg@gmail.com. And again, we will share this information in the chat and the Google Doc as well, and the websites. Checks written out to the Association de Cubanos Juan Gilberto Gomez. You can mail to the address listed. And then the solidarity travel for this year is we're going to be joining the Calixto Garcia Solidarity Brigade in 2023. Allison, is this brigade still open, accepting open invitations?
Certainly is, yeah, and it's based here in Canada, but it is open to anyone. Very much encouraged. It's one in Eastern Canada or Eastern Cuba, so a different kind of experience.
Wow, wonderful. And so if you're interested in that, here the information will be also shared in the chat. And we'll be celebrating our 5th anniversary in Cuba. This brigade is based in Canada, as she just mentioned, but open to all participants from different countries. The Solidarity Brigade will run from November 26th to December 8th, 2023. Again, that's November 26th to December 8th. If you are interested, please send us your name and we can add you to our list and your spot. Email at calixtogarciabrigade@gmail.com.
Thank you, T. So we're almost at the end of our announcements here. As we said, fall is a very important time for solidarity with Cuba. There's a lot happening. Check with your local committee. If you don't know who you might be a contact in your local committee, feel free to message me directly now and I can put you in touch with someone surely. But I wanted to just really encourage people also to sign on to the Let Cuba Live petition. This is a campaign started recently to gather more than 1 million signatures to tell President Biden to remove Cuba from the list of state sponsors of terrorism. The petition can be signed online in the link that we'll share, or you can print them in paper, take them with you to events, and then upload them later to help add your signatures. I encourage people to please go to that website link and add your name and get others to sign as well, so we can deliver these 1 million signatures to the White House. Also, if you happen to know about another Solidarity Brigade, we know about May Day brigades happening. We know about the next edition of Venceremos Brigade or Pastors for Peace. Please put those all in the chat. I know that was a lot of information, but all of it useful for our continuing solidarity work. And now we've got quite a few questions in the chat, which is really excellent. I will warn folks that, as T mentioned, Dr. Helen Yaffe did step away. It is extremely early in the morning for her, so she's not going to be here to answer our questions, regrettably, but we will surely have her with us again. But I wanted to start our question and answer with what I think has been the most common question so far, which is really that folks, are saying in different contexts that the economic situation in Cuba today is similar to the challenges faced during the special period in the 1990s. And, folks are also saying they disagree with that. So in the solidarity movement, the question is just, how can we explain or respond to this question? And I asked Dr. SILVIA ODRIOZOLA if she'd be able to take the first response to this question about the similarities and differences with today and Cuba's special period. Thank you.
Bueno, yo creo que lo primero que habría que
I
decir
think that, first of all, we could discuss this issue on a whole webinar, because we could also analyze it from the different perspectives, the changes in the international context, the situation of Cuba. But just to give you some elements, at least, to start thinking of this issue, I think that there's an ongoing debate in Cuba, and we can't seem to agree either here. I think that there isn't a clear answer for this. I think that there are elements that bring these two periods apart. There are economic and social indicators that look much better today than in the 90s, and others that don't. So it depends on many factors. Now, I think that in order to identify some differences, but of course, as I mentioned, this is something that we need to discuss further. The international context of the 90s is not today's context. The correlation of forces is not the same. The causes by which the crisis, the international crisis that's going on, and its impact on Cuba, which because Cuba relies on certain factors, and the conditions are not the same. During the 90s, the Latin American context was different, and these are all factors that somehow have an effect on the way in which Cuba has to participate in the global economy and establish its own trade and economic relations with the world. Now, if we talk about the domestic part, the starting point is not the same either, because Cuba was coming from an economy that had more reserves in a bipolar world with relations with the socialist world. And of course, those conditions are not the conditions Cuba is dealing with right now, because there's a huge international crisis that is having an effect on Cuba. And of course, the health situation, which has worsened the whole situation of crisis in our country. The Cuban economy is not the same today. Our economy is completely different. During the 90s, tourism was not a pivoting sector in the economy, because that's when it began to be developed. Biotechnology was a sector that in the 90s, our commander had been smart enough to know that science needed to be one of the fundamental pillars of Cuba's development. And the 1990s were a good moment to harvest that. But the situation is not the same today. The structure has changed. The sectors in Cuba have changed. The composition of the relations in terms of property is not the same. Cuba's economy was mostly state-owned, and there was some participation from cooperative organizations. Today, we have a more plural economy because of the expansion of these cooperatives to other sectors, and also the growing participation of private property and its performance or its effect on the development model. These are all elements that affect the context. So they have some common elements. One of the major economic disbalances faced by Cuba in 1990s is similar if we consider the impact of inflation and the convertibility of our currency. So there's a set of elements that we could say that are similar. And actually, Cuba has lessons to learn from that experience. The participation of foreign investment is different today. During the 1990s, there was only an executive order that allowed for associations with institutions abroad. Now, today, we understand that foreign investment is essential for the development of our country. And as I was saying, we're talking about a blockade, so the impact is much stronger when we talk about the role of foreign investment. Now, there's a common element in both contexts, because on each historic moment, the blockade remained, and it even became worse. Every time Cuba has had to face a deep crisis, the US blockade became even stronger. Let's remember that in 1992, the Torricelli law was signed. Then in 96, the Terry-Burton law. And then in the past recent years, the 243 measures implemented by Donald Trump, which became very evident in the pandemic, meant one of the most painful moments in the last few decades, so because so many people were lost. And I think that one would expect that in that context, humanity and solidarity would rule. And that's what happened in Cuba, right? Cuba sent its doctors to fight COVID. It tried to develop its own vaccines because it was impossible for it to access the vaccines from other countries, including the US, without foreign funding, only with its own resources, with the intelligence of our scientists. And within that context, the policy of the US was sustaining the blockade and even forbidding Cuba's access to certain resources. And I think that's an element that affects today's context, unlike other moments. I mean, as I mentioned, I could give a whole webinar about this, but basically, I think those are the most important elements.
Thank you. Sorry, T, I was just going to ask, did anyone else want to add anything to that before we go to the next question?
Allison, I'll make one really quick comment. The blockade impacts every aspect of Cuban life as we know it. It impacts housing, energy, transportation, public health, you name it. Cubans are impacted by the blockade. Having said that, my area of expertise is public health and the healthcare system. And I could say without a doubt that conditions are much worse today than they were during the special period. The shortages are dramatically different. And what hasn't been mentioned here is that when Helen used the word suffocating, the suffocating nature of the blockade, back in 94, 95, 96, everybody was in the same boat. Everybody was pushing in the same direction. Today, you've had massive migration out of Cuba. And people are suffering. People are having a very difficult time, and it's the blockade that's causing that. So now you walk into hospitals and you'll find doctors, nurses, surgeons have left the island. And it's not because of basic disagreements with the political system, it's the economic hardships that have just worn the country down. And to that extent, Washington is succeeding. So I'll stop there because I'm sure Isaac is probably jumping to get in.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the important points too, I think one of the distinctions as well is as tough as the situation is in Cuba. And I talk to friends who talk about the impact on the cost of living and so forth. I think one of the things that when we think of the 90s is the 90s was sort of a sui generis crisis for Cuba. Okay, we're now living at a time when there's an international crisis. that's engulfed the entire world, where the issues of the cost of living, the issues of surviving and so forth have become issues right here, even in my city in Halifax, where we've had an explosion of homelessness. But I also think there's an particular interaction between the international situation, this geopolitical moment we're living in, right? Which has given perhaps the blockade a new role as an instrument, right, in this geopolitical struggle. I think, with the emergence of the BRICS, and I think when we often think about the BRICS and we think specifically about their call for a new international economic order, we have to bear in mind that Cuba, perhaps obviously being a poor, small country, has often been the most powerful voice in terms of what this international new economic structure should look like. And I think in many ways, what we are seeing in terms of the call by the BRICS is a reiteration of the call for a new international economic order that emerged in the 1970s and 1980s, with Cuba as the major intellectual wellspring of that and so on. So this war that the United States is waging against Cuba, and I was at a presentation at a conference in Havana a few months ago. And one of the points when people talk about why does the United States wage this economic war against Cuba, one of the important different contexts today or points today is that because there's an international dimension that's unfolded, right? And Cuba is seen as part and parcel, okay, of this new geopolitical dispensation that's emerging on the world. And the United States, as many people know, is determined to ensure that it remains the hegemon, that it remains the pole. And in sense, and with Cuba in Latin America being a real challenge to US hegemony in Latin America, I think one of the key questions or key issues is that this geopolitical moment is also driving the US economic war against Cuba. And I think that's a point we have to bear in mind. The geopolitics are really having a significant impact.
Absolutely. And again, thank you all for sharing your valuable insight on this subject matter. We have a long way to go, and this is an arduous struggle, but we will continue to, again, educating our people and also just keep pushing to get Cuba removed off this SSOT list and ending this blockade. So thank you all again, each of you, Bob, Dr. SILVIA ODRIOZOLA, and also Isaac SANEY. Thank you so much. we have a general question in the chat, in the Q&A that I think a lot of people ask, and this comes up quite a bit. And even though we provide like the links and other places where people can join in on the solidarity movement, the general question comes up, and I think any of you as panelists can take a stab at this, or all of you. What kind of pressure can we put on the non-US governments regarding the blockade? I'll read that again. What kind of pressure can we put on non-US governments regarding the blockade?
If I may, I think one of the important points was that at the recent gathering at the UN General Assembly, so many of the representatives of their country's leaders spoke out against the blockade, with many of them singling out the state sponsors of terrorism list. We see the small islands of the Caribbean. People probably can tell from my accent, I have Trinidadian roots, half my roots lie in Trinidad and Tobago. And the Caribbean and CARICOM has taken a very, very powerful stand, despite their vulnerability. Okay, we often say when the United States catches a cold, we catch pneumonia if we're lucky. And so we have, they've taken very powerful stands. I also live here in Canada, and we're very concerned about Canada-Cuba relations. Canada is the single largest source of tourism for Cuba. Canada is also the single largest source of investment in Cuba, and the largest single investor in Cuba as an entity is Sheridan International, which is based here in Canada. There has been a concerted campaign here in Canada by various sectors to try and sabotage those relations, to affect tourism, and in a sense to perhaps adopt similar policies that the United States has towards Cuba. That has failed. But I think one of the points that we can talk about specifically on non-US governments, as they say, is we see them standing up, and we see them standing up because of the extraterritorial nature of the US economic blockade, which impacts on their territory. And we also see, with the emergence of BRICS, we see a larger section of countries wishing to break out from under US dominance and break out under US dollar hegemony, right? So there seem to be some sort of geopolitical developments, as I've mentioned before, that seem to be percolating. Where these will go, none of us is a prognosticator, but there seems to be, at least at the moment, changes in the international economic and political architecture that will, at least at this moment, how permanent they will be, that seem to be pointing to ways in which people will want to challenge US hegemony and particularly challenge the blockade. One of the key things, obviously, is when people condemn the blockade in the United Nations and they vote to get it overwhelmingly, is, for example, for people to take concrete measures, right? And that's one of the problems we have here in Canada, is even though we have voted against the blockade, even though we have laws against extraterritoriality, in many cases, the blockade still continues to be imposed here. And of course, Canada is increasingly integrated into the US economy, and particularly into its military industrial complex. For us in Canada, that is a major concern. And we are attempting to build, among MPs and among other sectors in society, a bulwark against any sort of deterioration in Canada-Cuba relations. I'll stop there.
Does anyone have anything else to add to that?
I'll take a stab, and I'd like to take a stab from a US perspective. We've got a short window in the United States. We've got the presidential elections coming up next year. My guess is we've got no more than 2 months left in terms of political action that could remove Cuba from SSOT, and that can roll back all of the Trump executive authority. I think there were 243 of them that were initiated before he left office. So towards that end, the pressure, and I'm wearing my SANEY hat now, the pressure needs to be on the White House. Congressman McGovern from Massachusetts had a very powerful speech on the House floor this afternoon, calling for President Biden to immediately remove Cuba from the SSOT list. That's in my mind, that's a priority concern for all solidarity activists right now. If we don't win it now, we're looking at January 2025. And you could only imagine the suffocation that's going to be going on in Cuba between now and then. So it's imperative that we all put pressure on the White House.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I'm going to go to another question in the chat, in the Q&A box. It says, I hope one of the speakers take this on. A participant stated in the chat that there has been at least 13,000 political prisoners in Cuba, and that Cuba dies have access to food and medicines from US elsewhere, and therefore it is the repression and ruinous economy in Cuba that is the problem. Please respond to those. It's a weird, okay. Please respond, I think they misspelled it, to those who want to confidently defend Cuba and can do so. I don't know who wants to answer that. But this is
just to say maybe a clarification, because I think some of that was written a bit hard to read. I think part of the question is to say, like, people that say Cuba actually does have access to food and medicines. It's the government that's not buying them. The question is asking, what's a good response to this question that we as solidarity activists could employ to help explain?
Yeah.
I think Bob is the best to answer that question, but I do have a story I would like to tell that sort of demonstrates how that this is completely untrue. But Bob?
I mean, I don't honestly have an answer to that. I believe with all my heart that the Cuban government is going out, they're purchasing everything that they have the capacity to purchase. The reality is that there's just not a lot of hard currency these days. And the blockade prevents them from the normal credit terms that every other country and every other company is afforded. So, you know, if you don't have cash, you can't buy things. I think they're doing the best they can under extremely, extremely difficult conditions. So I think I'm not an economist, so I'm not going to pretend to know more than that.
And what's important here is they persecute people who are able, in many cases, to get these needed resources to Cuba. I'll give you an example. Bob mentioned the syringes campaign. And the syringes campaign began first as an initiative of the Canadian Network on Cuba. You know, we had run various medical campaigns, and at the heart of the COVID, we said, okay, we can help Cuba. We can actually do something concrete, which will have a significant impact beyond just simply a symbolic solidarity act. So we tried to raise funds, and we raised a lot of funds to buy syringes in Cuba. We had to buy the syringes somewhere else, somewhere across the world. And in order to do that, right, okay, where we could not have Cuba mentioned in any way in the transactions. Why? Because once that happened, you would run afoul of US sanctions, right? Many banks don't want to deal with that because that involves a whole number of problems, possibly even fines, right? So what happened, and this is very interesting, is we found a very roundabout going through different ways in which to pay for these syringes, right? Okay, the container and the syringes and so forth. And we had somebody who was a private business who, you know, we went to who used this thing. What happened was we got the syringes to Cuba, and then a few months later, this person, basically the money went to where it went, had nothing to do with Cuba because we did that stuff. This person was tracked down, okay, by OFAC, right, and through the Canadian bank, his life was ruined, his business was destroyed. Okay, there are more people in the Office of Foreign Asset Control monitoring transactions with Cuba than they are monitoring so-called terrorist groups across the world. I don't think people realize this. This is what we would call in basketball, I'm not a basketball player, a full court press against Cuba. And I'll give you one small quick story how this affected me. I was asked at one point to review a book manuscript on Cuba. It was dealing with one aspect of Cuban history. And the book manuscript was going to be published by Macmillan. Macmillan is actually owned by Springer, which is a company in Germany. Okay. And so I reviewed the manuscript, and they were going to pay me, you know, a few $100s for having reviewed this big manuscript. And they decided they were going to transfer the money to my bank account in Halifax, Canada. It was a transaction from Germany to Halifax, Nova Scotia. All of a sudden, I get a call from the Royal Bank of Canada, which I do banking with, and they said, we are questioning this transaction. And I said, why? Well, it has Cuba mentioned in it. And I said, well, why are you questioning it? Okay, is it because of US economic sanctions against Cuba, right? Okay, that's the word it is. And they said, yes. Okay, for something as small as that. And we all know why, because the United States controls the SWIFT system, which basically is the architecture, right? The backbone of transactions between banks. And if you're excluded from that, from the SWIFT system, which the US can do, you're destroyed as a bank, which is why, for example, UBS Bank of Switzerland, which held US accounts, Cuban accounts in US dollars, so Cuba could purchase things in US dollars, accepted a fine of $100 million, right? I don't think people really truly appreciate the monstrosity of the US economic war against Cuba. And so, and it's clear, as Bob knows better than I, how this affects getting pharmaceuticals, okay? I'll give you one more example. In Canada, one of the things we considered, right, was actually buying medicines for Cuba. So Cuba used to produce, Bob can correct me, about 80% of its own medicines, right? Okay, and they'd get the inputs, they'd buy them abroad. And so we were approached, could you buy some of these inputs for us? And we said, okay, well, maybe we could buy the actual medicines. And we were told by companies, pharmaceutical companies, when we went to buy in block, well, we can't possibly sell this to you because there might be some US component in it, and we would run afoul of US economic sanctions. sanctions, right? And they refused to actually let us sell any of this to us if they thought we were going to sell it to Cuba. So that's an example, I think, that really underscores how the US wages a war against Cuba, multifaceted, against every aspect of it, but and also against the health of the Cuban people. In a sense, it's genocidal if you read the 1947 Convention on Genocide.
Thank you for those responses. So we'll do one more question and then we'll ask for folks to do a wrap up. So think about what you might want to say. Dr. SILVIA ODRIOZOLA, someone is asking about the ability and kind of growth with Cuba's trade with China, India, some countries from Africa, how this might help alleviate the blockade or how this impacts Cuba. And I also wanted to add any reflections you might share of the recent G77 plus China meeting, very important meeting taking place in Cuba, and Cuba is now the head of G77. So how this fits into questions of economy in Cuba, if you have some comments on that, please.
Bueno, yo creo que, como decía ahorita,
I think that, as I said before, since Cuba is a very open economy that requires strengthening of its trade relations with the rest of the world, any forced correlation that can allow for Cuba having better trade opportunities and with other countries is undoubtedly beneficial for our economy. And of course, these are alternatives to seek other trade partners. Other trade partners that can alleviate the prohibitions that we face in order to trade with the United States. Also, it's true that some of these countries are farther away, and that entails more expensive trade relations with them. And it's also true that there's not always an availability of these countries' business sectors to trade with Cuba because of the fear of the blockade and this financial persecution by the United States. But still, everything that entails an improvement in Cuba's opportunities to continue trading with other countries is a way of alleviating the impact of the blockade. But also, I wanted to share with you that in all scenarios, Cuba has always been willing to have political, diplomatic, and trade relations with any country. The only thing that we have asked in exchange is to have our right to self-determination be respected, as all countries do. They request that their rights to decide their future to be respected, even if we have some differences in terms of political systems with any countries. This have never been obstacles for our trade relations. We have always been willing to sit down and discuss with the government of the United States to try to normalize the relations with that country. But also I wanted to comment very briefly that, well, to answer the previous question, I didn't want to take the floor, but I will take this opportunity to comment something. I would answer with a question as well, because I think in all countries all over the world, the situations are different. But I would ask, well, how many economies in the world are not facing economic restrictions as well? Economies that have their growth process slowed down, or that are facing social inequality or political instability, which is something that does not happen in Cuba, or countries that also have a history of complex relationships with the United States, for example, Vietnam or China. And however, still, these are countries that do not, or countries where there is the Communist Party ruling, such as China and Vietnam, and other countries that, given religious and political problems, that have political prisoners. So the question is, why are there not any blockades with those countries? Why is there a positive relationship within the United States? So I think this is something that we can use. The Cuban case is specially addressed by the United States government. And as you said before, Cuba still is a clear example of dignity, of not renouncing to our principles. And I think that is something that distinguishes us. And so to answer your question as of what you can do to continue helping us, I think people have said this before, well, to continue doing campaigns and exerting pressure. And here we are here to support you and thank you. And here we are resisting, which is what we have always done.
Thank you very much. So I think we're getting late on the East Coast. I know. I'll tell you truthfully, it's not even dark out here in the West, but out East, I know it is dark. And especially in Havana, where Dr. SILVIA ODRIOZOLA is and others. So we'll go ahead and do our wrap up. There is a quick question that just came in. It says, is it true that any product from any country that has 10% of products that are manufactured in the United States is part of the blockade, cannot be traded to Cuba? So I'd like that question answered as part of this wrap up. And that we'll go ahead and start with Isaac, then Bob, and then Dr. SILVIA ODRIOZOLA, if that's okay with everybody. Isaac, the floor is yours.
Yeah, I'd just like to say it was wonderful being on this webinar. And my mind always goes back to the first time I saw Fidel live when he gave a speech in 1994, November 25th, if I remember correctly, at the First World Conference in Solidarity with Cuba, where he said at the end, he understood what it would mean to the progressive, the peace-loving and justice-loving peoples and forces of the world if imperialism crushed the Cuban Revolution. That is what the United States wants to do. This economic war is not only to crush the Cuban Revolution, but to destroy the possibility of hope, the possibility of imagining a world free of exploitation and oppression. And Cuba, as Dr. SILVIA pointed out, is resisting, and Cuba has always resisted, right? And we are resisting along with Cuba. And I think it represents the inspiration and a beacon of hope for all of us in the world.
So it was a real joy to join all of you tonight. And like Isaac, I always enjoy these sessions. But I would have three asks for what we do when we leave this call. Number one, as I said earlier, I think maximum pressure on the White House, maximum pressure on members of Congress to get something done now. Because if we don't do it now, SSOT designation will stay until after the presidential elections. Number two, the NNOC meeting. If you can attend, go to Boston. If you can't, register and join virtually. It's important that we all act, as Cheryl Bash said, we all act as one. We need to really pool our resources and make a concerted effort collectively. And number three, I'll just make a pitch for Global Health Partners. If you want to help, ghpartners.org, www.ghpartners.org. We have a campaign specifically, as I said, for hospitals across Cuba. So if you have any money to spare, please send it our way. Thanks, and we'll catch up soon.
Bueno, creo que
I think that it's a bit about answering the question, but also wrapping up, right? So the answer to the question is yes, that's the case. It seems ridiculous, but that is true. It's impossible, right, to think of a product that does not have some component coming from the US. In a world where even though tags continue to say made in China, we know that the components of the products come from many different places, because that's the trend in the past few years, right? The diversification as part of the process of internationalization and globalization. So yeah, it seems absurd, but it's true. And Cuba is not allowed to have international transactions in US dollars. Another absurd thing is that Cuba has no access to the funds of the IMF or the World Bank, which might seem unthinkable for any country, in particular countries in developing countries or countries from Latin America. So the blockade bans us from all of that, which may seem normal in most countries, but Cuba does not have that possibility. So I would, because and as we mentioned, we update the report on the impact of the blockade. We update it every year, so you can see the accumulated cost in terms of billions of dollars, how that has affected our country. Any country could be a beacon of social and economic development in the world. But I would just like to thank you all, friends in solidarity in the US. We always say that the government of the US and its policies is not the same as the people of the US. There are so many people, more and more, every day in the US and in other countries, and together, Cubans, Canadians, Latin Americans, Americans, Europeans, we all work together for a better world that is expressed in this idea of trying to end this hostile policy by the US against Cuba. So I would just like to thank you all, and we will continue to fight together, resisting for a better world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Silvia ODRIOZOLA, who is the Dean of Economics at the University of Havana. Very honored to have your perspective and knowledge with us tonight. And thank you to all of the other panelists, Dr. Helen Yaffe, the words from Isaac SANEY and Bob Schwartz, and then of course the video from Mike Vega, very appreciative, from the US-Cuba Normalization Conference Committee. Also, a big thank you to everyone that sent in donations to help with the translation. Some folks already did. You're very fast and it's much appreciated. Of course, any additional will go towards future webinars and donations. And then as well, thank you to the translators themselves, to Celeste and Julieta, for making this a fully bilingual webinar. The recording in Spanish will be on YouTube, and then the recording in English will also be on YouTube, so you can access either version. The Facebook video is in the original language. And of course, thank you to T. It's really been great to co-MC with you tonight, and I'll leave the closing words to you. Also, just the Google Doc, as is over here reminding me, the Google Doc with the links is in the chat. So press download on that and you'll have most, if not all, of the links that were shared tonight. So thank you from here in Vancouver, and we hope to see you soon in the blockade on Cuba and take Cuba off the list of state sponsors of terrorism. T, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Allison. It has been a great pleasure to be in this space with all of you and to share this space hosting with you, and you just providing us with so much information as we push forward in our solidarity movement globally. And Bob Schwartz, thank you for your insight on everything moving the global health partners. We look forward to supporting them more. Isaac SANEY, Dr. SILVIA, thank you ODRIOZOLA, thank you so very much. And thank you to Dr. Helen Yaffe too. We appreciate her insight and so much information learned in her commentary as well tonight. But thank you all. We look forward to the fight continuing, la lucha continual. Viva Cuba. En bloqueo no. Cuba sí, bloqueo no.
Cuba sí, bloqueo no.
Buenas noches.
Ciao.
Good night. Bye-bye.
Night all.
Good night.
Thank you.